Hi, my name is Anjali Sridharan from the UW-Madison Office of Sustainability. I had the recent opportunity to interview Erin Birdbear from our campus to learn more about Native November and also to learn more about the state of Native American culture in general. Enjoy the interview. Thank you.
Yeah, Hanachata Haipi. Aaron Birdbear Gahini Gaide. I just said hello in the Ho-Chunk language, the people of the sacred voice. And I just do that because the University of Wisconsin-Madison is located on the ancestral and treaty-ceded lands of the Ho-Chunk Nation. And so it's always important to acknowledge whose ancestral kind of place and ways of being that we should acknowledge in some way when we're kind of guests in indigenous lands. So I just wanted to say that. And my name is Aaron Birdbear, and I am a member of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, the three affiliated tribes of the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, of which I am Mandan and Hidatsa. And I am also Dene. Most people know us as the Navajo, as the Spanish called us the Navajo, but in our language, we're the Dene, the people. And so I'm Mandan, Hidatsa, and Dene. And I'm a guest here, and it's been wonderful to learn about the amazing indigenous cultures and nations of the Western Great Lakes.
And could you also please tell us what your role is on campus?
Yeah, for campus, I've been on campus for 20 years, so I've had a variety of roles, mostly in student affairs. I initially supported American Indian and Alaskan Native and Native Hawaiian students at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the early 2000s. I then began working in the School of Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, supporting historically underrepresented students interested in education majors. I then became an assistant dean, supporting kind of graduate programs and pre-college programs and undergraduate programs. And then recently I was appointed as the inaugural director as the tribal relations director of the University of Wisconsin in Madison to help us forward our relationships with indigenous nations, to work on kind of collaboration, innovation, and items of mutual concern.
Excellent, thank you. It's nice to have a role like that on campus.
Yeah, there are about 20 such roles in the United States today. So it's not a new role. And actually we're kind of catching up to some institutions who've had these roles for some time. And so it's an emerging component of higher education. It just reminds us of the value of indigenous knowledge, that these new positions are coming up in Research One universities throughout the United States as people see a tremendous value in partnering with indigenous nations to help us kind of deal with the complexities and challenges we face as a species on our planet today.
Well, I'm glad that University of Wisconsin-Madison also has that role. I appreciate that. Thank you. Now, I'm specifically contacting you today about Native November. And can you tell us about the history of Native November at UW-Madison?
Well, yeah, Native November, you know, it goes back to before my time on campus, right? So I arrived in Native American Heritage Month that was already established as a national holiday in the 1990s. In 1990, actually, as a kind of a joint resolution by President then George H.W. Bush. And so that was a kind of long kind of culmination of people trying to think about indigenous nations and peoples and how we can celebrate one another in some way as a settler colonial society. And that's the complex part of this holiday. It's like, okay, I guess for indigenous peoples, every day is Native American Heritage Day, right? And so it's interesting with a settler colonial society that, you know, 1 month out of the year is set aside to kind of, as we as a society collectively try to know all the different kind of cultures and languages and viewpoints that create our contemporary society today, that we're interested in learning more about each culture. And so it is a way for us to springboard into it. But for indigenous peoples, you know, every day is Native American Heritage Day. And settler colonialism, which just a reminder, the goal of settler colonial societies, and this is all settler colonial societies, the goal is replacement. And the United States made its best effort at replacement to eradicate indigenous languages, to eradicate Native American culture. And Native American language and culture was criminalized until 1975 when I was in elementary school, that we finally decriminalized Native American culture. So it's interesting in the concepts of settler colonialism, what this particular focus is trying to accomplish. And it's just a reminder that Native Americans, you know, have always been here. Our cultures have been powerful and strong for millennia in this continent. And through the agency and sophistication of Native American leadership in the early 20th century, began making inroads to establish an American Indian Day or an American Indian focus. And so through that process, it eventually resulted in 1990 of the Native American Heritage Month designation. And so universities and communities always want to kind of showcase and learn more about each other Indigenous nations are like an international community. We have over 45 Indigenous nations represented in the UW-Madison faculty, staff, and student bodies.
Wow.
So, we need to learn about each other too. So it's often really exciting. Native American Heritage Month promotes different types of events for us to all learn about different forms of Indigenous nations, communities, policies, and issues that impact us in dramatic ways. And so I think it's just really exciting that Indigenous knowledge from all these different Indigenous cultures and societies here in North America, or Turtle Island as Native Americans might refer to it, that we have this chance to really think and examine and learn from Indigenous peoples and from Indigenous knowledge. It's so amazing to see how robust Native American Heritage Month has been under Wong-Shuk's stewardship. So Wong-Shuk is the Native American student group that formed in the late 1960s on campus when Native Americans began returning to higher education in significant numbers. And we only had 33 Native American graduates from UW-Madison up until 1975.
Wow.
So, this core nucleus of motivated community members came together and formed Wong-Shuk, the Native American student group. And Wong-Shuk is Ho-Chunk language for, Wong-Shuk just is like human being. So we like the human being student group. So Wong-Shuk is just really powerful in starting to organize the community and engage the campus. And so kind of when I think about Native American Heritage Month, I always remind me that Wong-Shuk and these amazing student leaders who coalesced in the 60s and have exploded into a much larger population today, sustain all these robust events. So I'm really thankful to Wong-Shuk for their efforts in keeping Native American Heritage Month front and center for us as a community to organize around and showcase and share our different Indigenous knowledge with one another. And with the goal of settler colonialism as replacement, one of the most important things to do is eradicate our languages and cultures. And the United States spent 100 years attempting to do just that by family separation, forcibly removing children from their families. 3 of my 4 grandparents were all forcibly removed from their families with the express goal to eradicate our Indigenous languages and cultures. And they did it through violence. So Native American children for almost 100 years who were put into this youth incarceration system experienced tremendous amounts of physical, sexual, psychological violence that people would be kind of arrested for today. So it's just a reminder of the incredible trauma and the need for truth-telling and reconciliation with Indigenous nations, considering the incredible harm enacted towards Indigenous nations up until 1975 in particular. So it's still very recent and very fresh. And so Canada in particular has begun a process as one of the 4 British colonies, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, all enacted the same exact settler colonial model of replacing Indigenous knowledge, replacing Indigenous society with new languages. And so they've all been reconciling their kind of harm they enacted to their Indigenous societies. Canada, by far and large, has really moved forward, as has New Zealand. And truth and reconciliation is a process to examine the harm and think about how we can continue to heal the harm. So it's really exciting to see this process has been underway from Canada, and by no means is it smooth or linear. It's a work in progress. And so hearing about decolonizing education is just really powerful. As we Indigenous peoples think about how we can harness education now that it's not used as a tool of downward assimilation of trying to make us a labor class, an underclass in the United States, that we can harness education to lead our tribal nations in ways that we think are most important to do so, that are often grounded in traditional knowledge and traditional ways of being. So I just think it's really important to think about truth commissions and decolonizing education in particular, because that's really at the heart of our success, our Indigenous languages, our Indigenous cultures, and how we utilize them and employ that knowledge, particularly in higher education, will help a lot for tribal nations to continue to expand their influence and expand their kind of strength as Indigenous nations.
So at the end of Native November, what thoughts and ideas do you hope that UW-Madison attendees will come away with?
I hope that our faculty, staff, and students recognize how different Indigenous languages, in particular, Indigenous language, allows us to understand the world. And we then can reflect on how our own language situates us within the world. And so I speak English for the most part. I took Spanish in high school, and I was fortunate to take 1 semester of Diné Bizaad, or the Navajo language, at my university, at the University of Washington, Seattle. And that 1 semester of Diné Bizaad was without a doubt the most important class I ever took in college. And it showed me a worldview that I didn't understand before, just in the structure of the language, complete interconnectedness, complete interrelation. My Dene Bazad is kind of a language of action. Everything is doing something. A rock is not inanimate. It got there and it's going somewhere. So it just kind of reminds us of the interconnectedness of the world and how we kind of see our own value system and how we act upon that value system as living beings on this planet. You know, are we going to, try to express control over nature? Are we going to make a compact with nature? Are we going to try to sustain the health and well-being of all living beings, plant and animal? Or are we going to view them as products for commerce? So I think our languages really shape how we connect and situate ourselves within the world. And I hope through Native November, people kind of recognize Indigenous languages really teach us a lot about who we are as people in society and our values. And I hope people recognize that we need to make, similar to the moonshot or all the different kind of metaphors or analogies we use for putting our best effort forward, that I hope we as the faculty, staff, and student community recognize that the Indigenous languages of the Western Great Lakes are extraordinarily endangered. There are less than 6 fluent speakers of Menominee, a language that has been spoken on the shores of the Lake Michigan for at least 10,000 years. We have Ho-Chunk languages has fewer than 35 fluent speakers, and they're all over the age of 60. There might be just one fluent Ojibwe speaker in Wisconsin today. There are lots of partial speakers, but not necessarily fluent speakers. And so I think one of the efforts that we as a campus community hopefully take away from Native November is the importance and power of Indigenous languages to help us understand the challenges we all face collectively.
And last but not least, is there anything you would like to add about Native November or Native American Heritage Month in general that you'd like us to come away with?
Yeah, I think it's that Indigenous people are in a powerful cultural and linguistic revitalization movement. I remember that, I was in elementary school when the United States was still trying to eradicate Native American language and culture. And people just don't really think about what that means in terms of harm and family. The year I was born in 1971, 1 out of 3 of all Native American youth were removed from their families and put into foster care in the state of Minnesota in an attempt to detribalize us. So I'm born in 1971. I'm lucky I'm not one of the 3 who were removed from their families. And I've known 2 of our staff on campus over the years who were adoptees through that process of trying to detribalize us by putting Native American children out of their families into other places where they would not have access to their culture and traditions. So I think for me, the real power is this cultural and linguistic revitalization movement that we've been under now that from 1975 forward, after the passage of the Indian Self-Determination and Educational Assistance Act, that Native Americans have really found their footing in the 21st century in terms of how we can sustain our cultures, how we can kind of move forward. But we still have many, many challenges to face as an Indigenous societies in terms of health, education, kind of mass incarceration. These are all still profound issues in Indian communities. But we have our cultures, languages as assets today to help us spring forward in this cultural and linguistic revitalization movement.
Wonderful. So the Indigenous recovery and revitalization is a big deal, and I think it's a wonderful thing that's happening, the springboard that you're talking about. Well, Aaron Bird-Bear, first UW-Madison Tribal Relations Director, thank you so much for taking the time to explain to us about the importance of Native November and Native American Heritage Month.